Andrew.
Uh, there's been quite a bit of uh, particularly science and research lectures down in Hobart. So I'm in Sydney today, but there was a showcase of research lectures in Hobart, um, and I've just been following some of the other things that are going on around around the world with obviously with the Alliance, and and all of the events that it's promoting, and quite a lot online as well. There's a big campaign down here at the moment, a street campaign actually, uh, run by the Bob Brown Foundation. So he was a senator in the Australian Parliament um, a few years ago and established a foundation for environmental conservation, and they're running a massive campaign against Swiss supplements for the krill fishing that they're doing. So they've got this animation of a long line fishing net going up into a Swiss krill container on the back of a trawler. It's devastating. Both the street campaign, the posters, and online. So that's well timed as well. They've been running that through most of November around the importance of krill in our oceans.
Sure.
Right. Shall we make a start, Tamsin?
Sure.
Hello, everyone. I'm Barry. I'm going to be facilitating today, as I have facilitated a number of previous conversations. This is a mature conversation. It's one we've been having over the past year or so. It's a particularly appropriate to be holding this today on what is Antarctica Day, a really important global issue that Avala Kilmurray, when she summed up our last discussion, was really impressed with. But she said, why don't we know about this in the world? And that's a kind of critical thing we need to get to grips with and have been trying to get to grips with. But today we're going to kind of catch up with progress. So if you haven't been here before, don't worry, you're very welcome. All of the speakers, and there are going to be four of them, very briefly kind of bringing you up to date with what's happened and what's happening. We'll actually assume that they'll just run through what the key issues are as well as giving an update. But I think one of the things we want to come out of this session, and it's going to be very participative, is to think what do we do about this, because there is a serious issue here. Linda last time I think said, people have this stereotype that the Antarctic is just about penguins and ice, but it's actually really the serious refrigerator of the world, as Andrew often says. So we really need to kind of look at this from at least two angles. What is happening in terms of the governance of Antarctica itself, but also what does this mean for the kind of planetary dimensions of environmentalism, and also the dimensions of peace. And we've got a lineup of starting with Andrew, who's in the middle of the night in Australia. Great you've actually made it, Andrew. Would you like to tell us about the 66th anniversary of the Antarctic treaty signing, and where we stand with that now? Over to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Barry, and welcome everyone to this conversation tonight, and your day. It's terrific to have you here and to be in this really unique group and unique dialogue. So today is the anniversary of the 1959 signing of the Antarctic Treaty, which is one of the high point achievements of humanity to reserve Antarctica, the icy continent, for peace and science after the Second World War and in the shadow of the Cold War, and to reserve it for peaceful demilitarized use, and that has worked out reasonably well for the best part of 66 years. The the course of tonight is really to open up a planetary commons inquiry into Antarctica. Antarctica, if you've been on any of the other calls, but we'll certainly deal with some of the issues today, is really everybody's problem. It is as humanity's household fridge, if you like, and it's on the blink, as we say here in Australia. So we really do need to sit up and take action. And there's a great reason why no action is currently being taken. It's because nobody really knows about this in a substantive way. And like the hole in the ozone layer about 40 years ago, once general awareness took place, agency and then action came to the fore, and it became everybody's problem, and so we acted. We have here now, in this case, a separation of object, albeit a planetary hyperobject in Antarctica over there, and we're all over here, and really because it is so remote, wherever you are, it's a long way away from you. And so to where we have got to after a series of dialogues is for this to be the site of planetary inquiry, to prove the field of questions of what is possible in a particular way. Over 2026, the year ahead, we've got an exciting program of dialogue and inquiry, of feedback from these conversations and gatherings and invitations to participate. So we want to keep this community completely informed, keep the space open for ideas and energy to emerge for the projects and initiatives of the year ahead. And we're talking to people and institutions about funding this, supporting this, aligning with this nature of inquiry into this emerging space, so the people who are here and those who will join us can be on this journey. In the last session, we had Cormac McCullen. Great to see you here today, Cormac. Happy Antarctica Day. And Cormac's doing something really important, which hasn't been done before, around the legal status of Antarctica. So that's really important. Glad we've got that part of our conversation. Indy Johar, welcome, Indy. You kicked us off with Pre-emptive Peace way back in April and May, and there was great energy from the last session, with that provocation carrying through over. This is now the fourth dialogue. In the last session, what was really interesting was a lot of people were coming forward and saying, "I want to sign up for this. I don't really know what I'm signing up for, but I do want to sign up," and that's really encouraging. And also, what I'd like to say is that comes from the fact that these conversations are very countercultural. Usually, what happens in this type of space is a group of people come with a firmly held idea and trying to find a big audience and say, "Look, we've got the solution. We just need a whole lot of money to put our ideas in play." But what we know from our own experience is that design solutions from top down rarely work. And we tend to operate, develop an idea and create some kind of design and then seek funding for it. And it's almost always goes wrong because we don't actually use the principle of emergence, which is the way that systems change. We draw in people and ideas and resources and change as we go rather than coming up with a rather narrow or prescriptive model. When it's top down, you end up in a barter economy. You've decided what the idea is, and then you've got to look for the people who want to join that particular idea. And there's always a boilerplate that says, "Look, we're very inclusive," even though the process at the beginning wasn't very inclusive at all. So when we go this way, we're using emergence to bring people and these ideas, and we're cobbling it together as we go. So it's loose, as we said in the pre-call the other night. It's more jazz than classical music, that's for sure. But it becomes increasingly attractive as those ideas emerge. Uh, what I'd say is over these conversations, which started with preemptive peace, we were simultaneously saying we're not sure exactly how to operationalize this yet, but we want to talk about a particular problem, which is the planetary commons, and the ideas will emerge. And Antarctica emerged as a site for experimentation in the planetary commons. This type of space, emerging space, is really rare. I've not seen it sort of develop and maintain over the course of almost a year. So in this conversation, I again want to bring together this group and surface ideas and responses that you've been percolating over these last few months, and to do this on Antarctica Day, both as a nod to the past and a provocation for our future. Just a quick word on planetary commons, Antarctica and a changing world. It's my view that any idea that has already been done is almost as certainly a non-starter. I think we've got to use that as a principle, which is that um, any idea that's deeply entrenched or established in the world, in what is now a very changing world, is likely that it's done because the issues we're confronting are both timely and unique. So we actually need to jump out of the space of containment and into entanglement with the world, with the citizenry, with nature, and with the connection between all of them. So, for example, the Antarctic Treaty System, which we celebrate today, but we also understand that and recognize that it's looking a little bit secondhand, as well as CAMLR, which is the the Convention for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, which governs the seas around Antarctica. These have been contained by consensus and largely have not done anything for 10 to 20 years. Everyone says, well, it's working as it should because it's based on consensus, but that we need to have consensus before we can move on. And this is the language of no action. This is the language of nothing happening, and under the old system, that being just fine. And so what these dialogues and these conversations have recognized is that that's no longer fine. The idea of consensus, not being able to reach consensus, and that being okay is no longer okay. So Antarctica is a branch division of this idea of the commons. It's just one that we've developed, so it's not designed to suck the oxygen out of the room when we can also be talking about the Himalayas, the Amazon, and other commons. But it does present a site that is replicable across those other commons, and so therefore we should be careful that we don't come up with cookie cutter solutions, say to Antarctica, because the Himalayas, the Alps, the Amazon, and the others will be different. And so the question is, what does a new political economy really look like? What are the institutional constraints to solving some of the problems that we have in these planetary commons? What are the demand constraints, the desire constraints for this new political economy? And what does participation from a global citizenry, which is both interested and engaged in the parallel trajectories of Antarctica, these planetary commons, and humanity, because ultimately our futures are tied together. And so with that, I'd like to hand back to Barry and then to Cormac to explore the work that Cormac's doing around the legal status of Antarctica.
Thank you, Andrew. And that really helps us kind of give us the big picture, but also the kind of some of the detail that we really need to kind of move forward. And I think you're absolutely right that emergence is what we need. There are no design solutions that we can simply take off the peg and implement that will actually deliver. But we do have, I mean, Cormac, good news. You've got a launch today. Perhaps you'd like to tell us a bit about it.
Thanks very much, Barry. Yes, it's a very exciting day for us today. We've launched the Antarctic Alliance, a global alliance of organizations and individuals who are working on what we're calling the Antarctic Rights Initiative. And some of you have heard me speak about this before, but it's essentially the idea that Antarctica should be recognized, Antarctica and the Southern Ocean should be recognized at international law as a subject with rights, something like a state, and that it should be entitled to be represented in international negotiations, like, for example, the climate change COP, and in courts. And because, of course, it is there are no indigenous people there, a voice for Antarctica would, in a sense, be a voice for nature itself. I mean, nature does include humans, but I mean, for the more than human aspects of nature. And it would also allow Antarctica, as it were, to hold states to account. It would be a player. But so what was very important for us is to communicate the idea that Antarctica is important to everyone in the world. We think that, traditionally, many people, speaking, for example, in Africa, where only out of all the countries in Africa, only South Africa is part of the Antarctic Treaty System. And the idea has been, it's some faraway place, and unless you're actually engaged in Antarctica research and have a base there, it's not much concern of yours. But now we know that that's not true. Andrew has talked about the importance of it. And if we don't protect Antarctica, huge sea level rise, ocean currents slowing down, catastrophic impacts around the world. So one of the ways of communicating that was to have a global launch. So we've had they launch activities running around the world, starting in hours ago in New Zealand. At 5 o'clock this morning, I was on the quay side of a little fishing harbour in Cape Town in South Africa, where we had Extinction Rebellion and dressed up in blue to represent Antarctica, and a wonderful troupe of dancers in white to represent the winds. And traditional blowing of kudu horns, and then we had other ceremonies and talks, etc. But it wasn't just performative. The idea that we're trying to communicate is, first of all, to emphasize what connects us to Antarctica, and that in the case of Cape Town is the whales that come up to breed in South African waters, and the winds which blow. And in fact, the famous tablecloth on Table Mountain in Cape Town is a product of the southeaster, so-called Cape Doctor from Antarctica. And so there were performances to celebrate that connection. And also we deliberately bringing in cultural elements, art, performance, music, etc., to communicate from the beginning that what we're talking about is a cultural change, a very fundamental cultural change. It's not the most obvious aspect, perhaps, is the campaign around law, but this is far, far more than that. And what I'm really excited about, and why I believe that today will be remembered not only as the anniversary of the signing of the Antarctic Treaty, but also as the start of a very exciting global movement to bring in all of the people who are outside of the Antarctic Treaty System, most of the world's population, but also most of the states in the world and other organizations, to get them engaged in Antarctica. And Antarctica, from our perspective, is this extraordinary global platform that we can use to unite people in order to hear more than human voices. In other words, if we are going to say we're going to speak on behalf of Antarctica, who are we? How do we determine who the legitimate representatives are going to be? But more importantly, how do we learn to listen to Antarctica? And that was beautifully symbolized in a social sculpture that we did this morning with a very gifted artist who had gave us all. We had to close our eyes, and he put something on our fingers and asked us to cradle something in our hand as if it were a baby bird. And then at a particular point, he said, open your hand and release it and open your eyes. And there was rolled up ribbons of paper, and they streamed out in the wind. And suddenly the wind was visible. And he asked us to imagine it as an extended organ of perception, so that our fingers were now flowing out in the wind and enabling us metaphorically to feel the wind more accurately. And he talked a lot about how we need to work on ourselves to enhance our ability to perceive if we're going to hear Antarctica. And then, of course, it allows us to mobilize people everywhere in the world to become allies of Antarctica, to stand with Antarctica. Importantly, I think it's a way of changing the perspectives of the dominant cultures. As soon as we see Antarctica not as an object, not as a territory to be owned, but as a subject with agency, we shift to the language of relationships and connections, and we have to look what connects us to Antarctica, the wind, the whales, etc., and the climate. But we also need to talk about the quality of our relationships. Do we respect Antarctica? Do we even think about what's good for Antarcticans when we make decisions? And that, I think, will lead to a change in human relationships and behavior. And what's important from our perspective is to shift the emphasis away from the idea that we should be managing Antarctica. Antarctica is wild. It knows how to look after itself. What we've got to manage is how humans relate to Antarctica. We've got to manage human behavior, not Antarctica. So these are important shifts which don't happen when you see Antarctica as an object. And the other points of strategic significance, I think, at this time is that this is an idea whose time has come, we believe. A 2019 report of the United Nations General Secretary General identified this Earth jurisprudence or rights of nature movement as the fastest growing legal movement of the 21st century. And certainly there's been remarkably rapid uptake of interest around the idea of the possibilities of Antarctic rights, probably in part because, as Andrew has said, the Antarctic treaty system is stuck in an impasse. If you're in a system where you have to make decisions by consensus and you've got some players who are operating in bad faith, it's very, very easy to block any progress. And that's what's happened. So it's very difficult to see it being reformed from the inside. But I think what really gives me faith that this is going to change the world very significantly, even if it takes a long time, is that I believe that what we're doing is better aligned with reality. In other words, this incredible community of life is held together by relationships. Ecosystems are formed by relationships, whether they're food chains, nutrient flows, energy flows, etc. And what we're trying to do is recognize the reality of Antarctica, both drawing on both science and also the wisdom traditions of various cultures, what we've learned about how to live harmoniously within ecosystems, and then use that as the guide to update our governance structures to govern human behavior insofar as it affects Antarctica. So big day, and I hope it's going to be a historic day. Thank you.
Thank you, Cormac. I'm going to turn now to Indy. Indy was the person who really kicked all this discussion off by raising the issue of really that peace across the world doesn't have the priority that it should, and we tend to be trying to do things around conflict after they've happened rather than thinking about preemptive peace. And Antarctica was one of the issues he identified, along with some others, that could be a trigger for violent conflict. And this led us down a journey where we began to look at whole systems, how peace and environment, human behavior, and so on is all interconnected, and how we might actually begin to use the learning from this part of the world to think about planetary, new forms of planetary governance, which, as most people will know, India is one of the kind of leading kind of thinkers on. So, Indy, let's circle back to where you started, and how does almost a year later, how does this sit with you now in terms of the kind of planetary dimension to this?
Firstly, just such an honor to be here on this day as well, which I think is really important, and just a kind of massive gratitude to Andrew and McCormack's work and leadership in what I think is a really important piece of like underrepresented and under-discussed space. I just want to start there more critically. I think the thing that I'm holding, and this is just, I mean, so when I was listening to Andrew, and I've just really enjoyed listening to Andrew in so many times and so informative, that I think this standing still no longer works. So if the status quo, the preservation of the status quo no longer works, and our legal governance systems are locked into now the preservation of the status quo. And in that status quo, we hit 3 degrees. And in that 3 degrees, we pretty much have blown the Antarctic, probably, in tipping point terms, and have vast amounts of issues on our hand. So the problem of space, I think that, and this is where I'll be slightly provocative, I think there's nothing left to conserve on the table. We can't conserve the current position. And I think the challenge that we're facing is that all of our mindsets are about the preservation of the present, when the present is already gone, because the underlying CO2 that's been released and is likely to be released means the present can't be preserved. And that throws us into a very difficult governance space, because we no longer can conserve, but we've got to regenerate and we've got to stabilize. We've got to come to new agreements, which are very difficult to achieve, as Andrew was rightly saying. And also, what we've got to do is kind of open up conversations about, well, how do you regenerate? How do you stabilize such planetary systems, at the micro and the macro level? And what does it mean to even do that? And it brings up dreaded words, which I think we all know why we don't like them. Words like geoengineering and all this sort of stuff on the table. And unfortunately, I think when I look at the trajectory in the model spaces, I now sit here with a deep worry that there's no pathway available without looking at those technologies and questions. And the question is, will those technologies and questions be done to us? I.e., will there be forces or weapons that are used by asymmetric powers, or will we as a planetary democratic civilization be able to find another way of geo-gardening was the word I used, to soften its perspective to actually, do we have a new way of stabilizing? So I think the challenge that we're facing is there's nothing left. We can't conserve the current position. The challenge that we're facing is we don't have the governance infrastructure to conserve our whole governance infrastructure is rooted in conservation. And the third dimension I think we're facing is then the technologies, and I use the word in its broader sense, of regeneration are a class of interaction that is kind of systemically deeply problematic and questionable, but where path dependency now being laid in front of us. So I think that's one thing. And I think for me, what this then starts to throw up is some fundamental questions and I think, what is good for the Antarctic? Can a good for the Antarctic be understood? Or is the good for the Antarctic actually fundamentally an entangled reality? And is it an entangled reality or is it a separated reality? And in that reality, how do we negotiate that? I think for me is one of the big questions. Second, as Andrew rightly mentioned, how do we construct a new political economy of the Antarctic, which is rooted not in the conservation of the Antarctic, but the intrinsic needs of every city on the coast of the planet, everyone that's living on the protein products of the Antarctic, directly or indirectly, the weather systems and other secondary systems. So we have to construct a new political economy, like we did with the, Andrew, as you rightly mentioned, the ozone hole. We have to start to think about a new political economy. And constructing that political economy then also has to then lay a pathway to constructing a new economy for the conservation, for the regeneration of the Antarctic and the Antarctic first, to put both of those poles on the table simultaneously, because I think we've got problems on both those poles systemically in that framework. And I suppose what I appreciate about this conversation is that we're at this tipping point problem between what we thought we could conserve the future by stabilizing ecological environments, and now we're at the point that we might have to be more active and thereby humanly engaged in not just the conservation, but the regeneration of those environments. And that opens up a whole moral domain of problems that I think that we're in the middle of. I wrote a slightly crazy piece talking about what 2075 would look like based on COP, and just saying, look, what's the likely future of our inability to make big decisions? And it lays out, it was genuinely an exploration exercise, and I'll share that, but it lays out a quite different way of organizing and being. So maybe my final point here is why this links to planetary peace. What I'm actually worried about, and if somebody wants, they can please get in touch with me. What I'm actually worried about, how biophysical volatility will drive systemic whiplashes into our global value chain, supply chains, environmental, and it will drive accelerating inequality and breakdown of social contracts that will drive violence. This pattern is going to manifest around the world through different biophysical volatility events. And our ability to perceive those and see those cascading effects into war and conflict will become increasingly accelerated as the volatility accelerates. And our ability to perceive nodes around the world which are vulnerable to that, susceptible to that, direct or indirect conflict, whether it's through fishing wars or protein wars, or whether it's through climatic destabilizations of kind of coastal places and landscapes which drive destabilization of population residences and large-scale population which destabilize those social contracts and other environments. We are living in that trajectory. And I suppose from my perspective, why I'm particularly interested in Dark Matter Labs is particularly interested in this, is that we've been building something around a civilization option, a fund focused on how do you expand civilization optionality. And that's something we've been working on for the last year, and we've got it to the point where it's now seeded. And we're looking at then various points in the world that drive these cascading event spaces and what are the new institutional arrangements. And this is, I think, where it gets to the really, for me, the interesting bit. These are new type of institutional arrangements, new types of political economies that organize these sorts of environments. You can imagine a new type of Antarctic governance institution, deeply entangled, deeply operating in a different way, deeply regenerating and stabilizing the Antarctic at various levels. And I think that leads a pathway that rhymes for me as possible pathway when you have 10, 15, 20 of these transnational systems or post-national systems. That leads a pathway to, I think, a pathway to planetary governance, which is not rooted in reinventing UN system in New York, but is reinventing transnational planetary goods in their location and re-entangling the planet through that means. And it rhymes with actually the birth of the UN system in the River Danube. River Danube, the international waters were born out of River Danube as a basis of effectively after having gone to conflict on the River Danube by all the various nation states. So I think there's something really important for the Antarctic for me as a site of planetary governance. I think if, and this is maybe where I stop, I think the future of planetary governments will either be discovered in the Antarctic because of all the conditions that I think Andrew lay out, or it will mark the tombstone for present-day civilization and its inability to do that. So I think it's an apex point of actually planetary governance being discovered. And that's why, for me, it's so critical in terms of being able to think about this stuff in lots of different ways. So I just want to thank everyone for being able to hold this conversation. That's the other thing I just deeply appreciate, is our ability to hold these sorts of conversations, which seem very, very much missing in the larger political domains, and to behold them with care and differential perspectives, and to hold this sort of tensions that we need to hold. So thank you.
Thank you, Indy. I mean, on that violent trajectory that you were talking about, we're in the middle of it. If you look at the statistics from 2021, the amount of violent conflict in the world has increased by 65%, and it shows no signs of slowing down. So the interconnectedness of all things, comes into play here. And these kind of tipping points that you isolated in your original paper are really, really critical. I noticed that Mike Friedman talked about what's happening in South Africa and what the implications there would be. And this is indeed a global problem. It's everyone's problem, and we do need some fast, radical kinds of different ways of thinking about this. And lifting up the issue is really critical, and that's what we're trying to do in a deep way. I'd now like to turn to Linda, who's been one of the few funders supporting this kind of work. Linda, have you any observations you'd like to make at this point in the discussion?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Barry. And once again, happy Antarctica Day to everyone. Just as an FYI, in case anybody is in the San Francisco Bay Area, we are co-hosting with Arrow Foundation a party tonight at 6 p.m. in San Francisco. You're all invited. If you're in the area, just shoot me an email. I'll put my email in the chat and I can let you know the details. And I hope to see you there. It'll be fun. And as we've been hearing, just a couple of thoughts on this. We are, as Cormac mentioned, we are launching the alliance that will help bring in voices from everywhere, all over the world, to raise up and elevate the idea of rights of Antarctica. We've been working on this idea as an ad hoc working group for a couple of years now. But of course, as we've been hearing, this idea cannot be a top-down, a selective process. It needs to be generated, as Andrew was saying, from the ground up. It needs to emerge. And that's the purpose of the Alliance, that we need this global movement and it has to be cultivated. So we're hoping everybody might sign up for the Alliance if they have not already. And I'll put a link in the chat to that. But we're already seeing success in this area. So in October, for example, the IUCN, International Union for Conservation of Nature, met. They only meet every 4 years. It's if you're not familiar with the IUCN, it's an organization with about 1,400 members, scientists, government representatives, indigenous representatives, lawyers, etc. About 90 nations represented. So it's not just a nonprofit entity. Also, indigenous governments are represented as well, and subnationals, including California, which just joined. And they passed a motion. They passed 5 rights of nature motions, including one on the rights of Antarctica. And I'll put the final motion in the chat as well after I'm done. And it will be implemented through a revised strategy that the IUCN just released in September. So they're turning the expertise of thousands of scientists around the world to really engage, and lawyers as well, to really engage on Antarctica and help move the conversation forward in a productive way. The new IUCN strategy actually specifically references rights of nature. So I'm particularly excited about that as someone who's been working in this space for quite a number of years now. So just a couple of other details that I think are important to think about. The concept of the alliance that we're talking about in engagement in Antarctica is grounded in part on fundamental political theory. Some folks call it the all affected principle, but it's a concept that suggests that those who are affected by decisions made by a political community or an entity should be part of the decision-making process. And this goes all the way back to the Romans, to Justinian Code. But it expresses this idea of what is the democracy is good for, which is to be able to have a say in decisions that significantly affect you. It recognizes that we're all part of a network of codependents who determine and provide opportunities for development while mitigating the risks to all of us. And then without that, as we've been hearing, we're likely to be subject to forces beyond our control, including violence and significant risks to health and well-being. So this reinforces this idea that everybody needs to be part of Antarctica, and we're all codependent with Antarctica and need to be engaged in decisions, not just a handful of nations who, I think Cormac said, happened to plant a flag in an ice a few decades ago. We all need to be part of this decision, and the Alliance is helping with that. But there are lots of forces at play that are help moving that forward. And importantly, not just people need to be part of this discussion. Antarctica, the Southern Ocean herself, all species need to be part of this discussion. And we need to figure out how to make that happen. And that, again, is an emergent process. We don't have all the answers. We've got ideas, but we want other ideas as well. And then finally, just to dig in, just one more point that I think is important to mention is that as a practical matter, and I'm a lawyer, the rights of Antarctica allows for active participation by Antarctica in things like, assemblies. We're seeing the rise of citizen assemblies as we recognize the importance of broad democratic participation, including the assembly in Ireland that addressed biodiversity and rights of nature. But it allows for active participation in these types of democratic institutions, but also legal processes such as litigation. And that can have real impact. We're seeing in the rights of nature movement that courts are making decisions on behalf of the natural systems and species that would not have been made under existing environmental law. And as an environmental lawyer, I really applaud that type of movement forward. And we're seeing a lot of opportunities arise in international courts in particular. Most recently, the International Court of Justice advisory opinion that came out this summer on climate change reinforced that there's firmly established international law that bans conduct that would irreversibly harm or could irreversibly harm a common ecosystem like Antarctica and the Southern Ocean. So having Antarctica participate in litigation potentially that references and reinforces that international law allows it to be able to articulate and have its own interests recognized, not just the interests of people who might be impacted by sea level rise, even though that's incredibly important, but also Antarctica's own interests for self. And then similarly, the Inter-Advisory Court of Human Rights, it was the first international court this summer that came out with a decision that recognized the rights of nature, again, in the context of climate change. And using that particular decision, the Inter-American Court's decision in areas where it has jurisdiction can also allow us to be able to have Antarctica's rights recognized. There've been some concerns with folks who are participating in processes today that say, well, I've got concerns about sovereignty. What happens to assertions of how we're managing Antarctica right now if we actually do move forward in this type of direction. And I would say, in reference to that, that we've seen with the court decisions so far on rights of nature, which have all been in nations that have sovereignty, asserted sovereignty over natural systems, that sovereignty is only enhanced by protecting the well-being and the thriving of people, ecosystems, and species that are within national boundaries. And in Antarctica's case, that would only be reinforced because we would literally see territorial claims melt away as ice disappears under climate change. So taking advantage of these international court opinions, the general opportunity for litigation, the democratic processes that I mentioned earlier, which are being developed as we speak and are emerging as people recognize our codependency. I think all of these elements are important as we move forward and try to define what it is we're talking about, which is governance that recognizes that we're codependent on a shared planet. So thank you for the opportunity to share a few thoughts, and I'll put these links in the chat.
Thank you so much, Linda. That's really helpful. So I think what's come out so far is that we're all agreed, I think, that the critical process needs to be one of emergence, that we need to build from the assets we have, the understandings we have, and the identification of the problems we see. So that in a sense that this conversation is really needs to be a creative one about how we can begin to build from where we are. And there is obviously expertise around that we can draw on, but the joining it in with this, the alliance is a really critical dimension of that. I mean, as both Linda and Cormac have pointed out, Antarctica is everyone's business, and we need to get behind that alliance. But there's another issue which is bigger than that. The one that Indy really has focused on, which is how do we actually use Antarctica and places like it to think about new models of planetary governance? Because unless we address those bigger systems, those global systems, and they're going to be different in every place, there's nothing we can do in terms of conservation that will actually stop the worst happening. So we need to be working at a number of different levels. There's not one right way of doing this, but there are right ways that we can kind of identify. And I wonder whether people would like to kind of contribute to this discussion on that basis so far. Any thoughts that people have about how we might actually apply the emergence methodology to the tasks, and I think they are plural, that actually take us forward. I would like to start.
I could certainly ask a question,
Sure,
Barry, if that's
do.
helpful.
Yeah.
I think the question I'm holding is what is good for the Antarctic? And like as a philosophical question. And then what am I and how is that good understood? Especially when the context is degrading. So we might be living in a moment where the Antarctic loses a vast amounts of ice cover and ends up with an explosion of life. So does that mean that's good for the Antarctic, not so good for the rest of the planet? And where does the thesis of good come from? And I think one of the things I found really interesting, McCormack, when we were, for example, chatting and around self-sovereign river in in the in New Zealand, and how one of the indigenous people that's been really right at the heart of it had said it's not self-sovereign, it's my grandmother, and talked about it not being separated, but rooted in relationality because of the indigenous rights that were associated with it, which from a Western theory has become objectified into self-sovereign nature things. But she was like, it's not self-sovereign, it's in a new relationship. It's my grandmother, and I relate to it, and it relates to me, which hasn't quite converted into the self-sovereign nature rights theory that's been expanded around the world. So I wondered, like, these two questions about how do we bury relationality into self-sovereign things, and how do we define good? Because I think that'll be the open question on this table, especially in a degrading environment. Those are the things that are really rattling at the back of my mind. So just for an open conversation.
Excuse me, it's Jim Barnes. If I could just say a couple of words, I'd like to introduce myself. A very interesting group and discussion. As background, just briefly, in 1978, I and three colleagues founded a coalition to protect Antarctica. That's called the Antarctic and Southern Ocean Coalition. And we did it because Antarctica, like you're all saying, wasn't represented. Nobody spoke up for Antarctica because there were no inhabitants there, among other things. And over the last 40 some odd years, we've had, I think, a pretty good record of holding governments to account. I'm not going to belabor all the different victories we did win along the way, but we stopped mining. We created an ecosystem as a whole fisheries regime, which is imperfect, but at least it's the world's only ecosystem as a whole fisheries regime so far. And Antarctica's problems today are not coming from what's happening in Antarctica. They're happening, they're occurring because of what's going on planetarily speaking, mainly climate change. If climate change didn't exist, Antarctica would be doing pretty darn good, actually. But with climate change, it's ruining everything. It's ruining the ecosystems. It's making it impossible for even the base, a tiny creature called a krill, a little shrimp, which everything in the ecosystem, including great whales and birds and seals and penguins, eat. And so for the coalition, the most grievous thing that's happening to Antarctica is coming from outside, from the buildup of carbon dioxide. What we've been trying to do in recent years is to create large marine protected areas. Again, we had some success. About 10 years ago, we succeeded in convincing these governments to create the world's largest ever marine protected area in the Ross Sea. It's working reasonably well, et cetera. But I just want you to keep that in mind when we think of all the things that you're thinking about, which we want to be part of that. We helped very much, in fact, pass the resolution at IUCN because we think it's an important discussion that the world should have. And the more people that care about Antarctica, the better, the more likely that something good will happen there. But we can't pretend that by having a new governance system for Antarctica, it will change anything, and it won't be, if that is possible, it's not going to happen anytime soon. So I like to keep things balanced in some way in our minds, in our heads, when we think of what can we do to protect Antarctica. And I think we can do a lot, and there's a lot that all these new ideas coming forward, the rights of nature and so forth, can accomplish. But it's mainly through raising global awareness about the importance of Antarctica to all of us. And again, there are so many slides I could show you about Antarctica feeds the whole world in a sense through the under the deep water flows of nutrients and so forth. Antarctica's ocean, the Southern Ocean, is deeply and primevally connected to all the world's oceans. And most people don't know that. Having worked in this space for, again, over 40 years, I know how hard it is to convince anybody else who doesn't, is not kind of intrinsically an environmentalist to care about Antarctica. It's far away, it's unknown, etc. And so my life's work, I'm 81 years old, so I'm getting near the end of, of my life's work, but it's been to raise public awareness and use that awareness to take protective steps. And like I said, we've had some successes. Now, just one last thing, and I'll stop talking. With colleagues over the last 2 years, we decided to write a book. Basically, it's called "Is Antarctica Antarctic as a Model for?" and it's got a lot of other words in the title. I'll circulate it to this group, or I'll send it to Cormac, and he can circulate it. But the book is just coming out today. We chose Antarctica Day to release this new book. And I wrote a chapter with the co-director of ASOC, but many other people, scientists, different people contributed our thoughts to Antarctica as a model for how to manage the world, for global peace, for moving forward, et cetera. And I think you all would find it stimulating and interesting. So I will circulate that book to Cormac, and then he can forward it to you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim. That's absolutely stunning and really helpful contribution. And I'm so glad you've kind of said all that, because you put so much, into that actually shows both the dimensions, the governance of Antarctica, but also the governance of the world and how they connect. So your work is, I think, if we can build on that and actually build up the campaign, that's really, to raise the profile of this issue, because that's a serious question. Thank you so much, and we'll look forward to receiving notification of your book. Very timely. Amia, would you like to go next?
Thanks, Barry. Yeah, I just wanted to say something quick based on your question about like what critical processes of emergence. I want to be just following up on James. I'm a strategic designer and life-centered and bioregional designer based in France currently. I'm a member of Tomorrow Collective in Copenhagen that works with democracy, value-based leadership, facilitation, and strategizing at local and larger scales. I would say that taking in the spirit of what the Alliance has already done, taking just the model of the distributed call for contributions in terms of the voices that were showcased today without going any further. So a distributed process, participatory process that in terms of funding applications can actually be the framework that's specific, which leads to a generative, open-ended result. So you don't have to define the focus as we traditionally approach funding applications. And so processes that define common languages, that use common languages, so the practice of nexialism, and bringing in as many traces and voices that connect the memory that many of us may not directly associate with Antarctica, but from our different filters of being able to read reality and relate to each other, as have been mentioned, all the nations that are along the coastline that are directly affected and will be severely affected in the shorter term, and just decentralizing the power from dominant institutions, cultures, and nations towards that interdependence is really important. And so processes of participatory design that are decentralized using the internet as a broad reaching platform of in-person collaboration, bridging like extensive networks of actors, taking into account the multi-species embodied representation of people from very different perspectives, is a process forward. So in futuring, like more evolved relational futuring exercises than it has been more traditionally seen in systemic thinking practice and fields, I would suggest. I know that I said a lot of buzzwords there, but I wanted to get it in more quickly. I know that words serve to, and it's recorded, so I know that these things can be searched, but if you have more questions, I know that it can be like I can leave my email if it's relevant, but I assume that some of you at least know what I'm talking about. I hope that made sense and it
It
wasn't too generalistic.
makes a lot of sense, and I love the approach, and I mean that fits very well with an emergent strategy, which is exactly what we need here, and actually a communication strategy to begin to get this talked about in different ways, and maybe that's one of the things we should be thinking about is how do we communicate, and how do we actually get your generation um, motivated with this, because young people have much more to lose than us older ones here, in terms of futures, because your future will be blighted, unless we can actually do something about this. So I think in a way that those kinds of technologies that you've suggested are really, really helpful, and we should be developing those. Um, Anybody like to come back? Would you like to come in at this point and make a comment about how you feel, how the discussion is going? Nobody got their hand up in a minute, but do people step forward and put your two penneth in?
Thanks, Barry. I'd just uh, like to say that regarding both Indian and Cormac's comments, and also Linda, we are finding ourselves now on a path dependency, which has been set up by great forces and powers in the past, and so we are on a path. There's also the fact that anybody who's spent any time either in Antarctica or contemplating it is immediately or is eventually brought into close contact with deep time. So when we talk about what is good for Antarctica, um, we need to see it beyond our minuscule lives of 70, 80, 90, 100 years. And what does it mean for a space that has been extant for millions of years? And it will still be here when we are long gone. And so that then brings in the idea of how do we engage with deep time, and how do we, as this group and an emerging group, have what I term a Chartres Cathedral type mindset, where we're going to lay down foundation stones that we won't see the end of the project, and building pathways for others who will put the final stones in place, but in 50 and 100 and 200 years. And so we really do owe it to our younger generations to create these pathways, to really not just hand the baton. I think one of the most cruel things that can be said in dialogue is, well, those young people, they're very innovative and smart, and they're really tech savvy. They'll come up with a solution to the problem. That's an abrogation of responsibility, a horrible one, and it leaves the younger generations feeling very hopeless. And also, just to Indy's point about what is broken and what does systemic breakdown look like, from a slightly darker perspective, there's a shift around, moving from conservation to mitigation and adaptation in the climate change space, and there's some worrying reports and conjectures at the moment that part of what we're seeing around the violence in our world, and particularly in Gaza, which is being beamed into our palms in almost real time, is a desensitizing to othering that to others' pain, and to the potential of large scale deaths that can occur not only in conflict, but as James has very aptly summed, the outside influence of climate change and what that means for extreme weather events, where, as Kim Stanley Robinson says in his book, that you have an extreme weather event in India which kills like 25 million people in 2 days. And then how do we respond to that as humans? And I think we've got to get in front of that. We've got to prepare ourselves as this group, but we also have to, I suppose, call it out and name what is happening, which is that the othering of humans, the othering of their pain and their torment and their death, ultimately comes back to the connection that we all have with each other and with nature. And so it's a little bit darker, but it's a proper consideration if we take account of deep time, but also the space of time that we are working over if we're working over our lifetimes. What is happening over the next 50 to 100 years within our lifetimes? These are some of the dynamics and breakdowns that we are going to have to deal with, all of us deal with. And we are currently finding ourselves increasingly in a dopamine economy. So long range issues can't compete with infinite scroll. And so that economy handles structural problems like we're confronting tonight as PR narratives. They're not redesigned systems. And subjectivity gets re-engineered. So humans start to experience themselves as a bundle of cravings, not agents with projects. So that's what's really important here tonight. We are a group of agents within this collective with a project or a series of projects, and that is pretty countercultural out on the main street.
Yeah, thank you. Cormac, you responded to Indy's question about what is good. Would you like to elaborate on that briefly?
Yes, it's India as usual has put his finger on one of the most challenging aspects of the whole thing, in the sense that uh, we've drafted the document requiring that one should act in the best interests of Antarctica. And I guess from the beginning, I was aware that because we are not Antarctica, it can't be Antarctica. We can never truly say as humans what's in the best interests of Antarctica. But nevertheless, I thought that if one was faced with the choice between policy option A and policy option B, science is probably clear. Our knowledge of Antarctica and particularly science is probably good enough to be able to say in most cases that policy option A is preferable for Antarctica than policy option B. In other words, but in the more philosophical, deeper sense, I mean, India, I think, explained it very clearly. Antarctica has not been in a constant state over its life of millions of years, and are we correct to take a conservationist approach? In other words, that we should try and keep it in the form that, shall we say, modern humans found it. I mean, it's hard to perhaps justify that, but I think if one sees it as a being, one of the arguments you would make is that just as the process of decolonization, the countries didn't ask for better governance; they asked for self-governance. They asked for freedom, independence from being ruled, as it were. And my guess is if the whales and the krill had a vote, they'd probably vote for that. But then, of course, as Indy clearly said, what happens if humanity can't survive without intervening in some way in Antarctic systems, slowing the melt of ice water, et cetera, as is dealt with in the Ministry of the Future book that was mentioned. And I think those are very complex questions. I don't pretend to have the answer to them, but I do think that asking them is very important, and that the process of unpacking them will be beneficial. So that's as far as I've got, I'm afraid.
Yeah, right. So the agenda is to unpack the questions and think about the emergence as the strategy of beginning to answer them. Linda, you wanted to comment on what Andrew had to say.
Yeah, thank you. And I really liked some of the points that Andrew was raising and think they're really critical about this idea as well of deep time. And, we do see that, we work in the climate change space as well, here at Environment Now. And as many of you do it too. And you do see some folks in power, who articulate the types of things we're talking about, like, well, we've been here before as humans, it's been much hotter, and we've been able to adapt, and et cetera. It's sort of this, sure, some folks may suffer, but they'll adjust, and it'll all be better. Some folks will be better off. And it really gets to this idea that Andrew mentioned, I think, of desensitizing and othering, especially with regard to others' pain, not just humans, but also the natural world. And that gets to a fundamental point that I think is worth mentioning. We were talking about rights of nature and legal rights for Antarctica, and I think those are important. But I think many folks would agree that at its base, these are proxies for moral standing. And the moral standing of humans who were denied rights was not considered. It was not important. As rights extended out to all humans, then it was in recognition of their moral standing as well. And we're doing the same with the natural world, but at its core, indigenous folks, and wisdom, of course, recognizes that relationality which aligns with moral standing, and that's where we're really having this discussion today is what are the moral considerations that we need to make when we're making decisions, because Antarctica has been around and will keep going, and what is good for Antarctica might shift over time, as the Earth has certainly shifted over time. And many of you probably know Dr. Alan Hemmings, and he has talked about these issues as well recently, and asks the question if we humans really think we have any prospects of safeguarding what we call the natural world if we don't recognize the independent moral standing of the natural world, of ecosystems and species. I don't think we do, because we won't be fully moral people without recognizing our relationality and the moral standing that goes with that. We won't be able to make fully moral decisions. And certainly Antarctica needs to be included in that circle of moral standing. And so right now we're using, the law to help move us forward. We're using science, et cetera, but fundamentally we need to make moral decisions, and we need to not other. And so, of course, the powers that be that have power over decision making right now, just as it was when not all humans were recognized as having moral standing, will push back. It took women 100 years to get to the right to vote, and how straightforward is that? But to recognize the moral standing of women, it took time and it took effort. And this gets to this idea of cathedral type mindset. So I just like to reinforce, I think that Andrew was making a really important point about desensitizing and othering. And I think that this gets to this idea of emergence and alliance and working together, but moral recognition, I think, is really at the core of it.
Thank you, Linda. That's very helpful indeed, and I think it brings together a lot of what we've been talking about. And it seems to me that one of the things that we could be thinking about is mounting some kind of inquiry that goes beyond the normal, usual suspects who think about these things. Because I think that, one of the things which really struck me about the last conversation we had when we invited Avala Kilmurray, who's a very well-known person who is one of the key actors in bringing peace to Northern Ireland over several decades. And we were talking about and responding to Indy's paper about planetary peace initiatives. She said, "Why don't I know about this?" And she's one of the most well-informed people I know. So that in a sense, I think part of what we can do as a group is begin to sort of think about how do we sensitize the world to some of these issues. And it's not just about the governance of Antarctica, though that's an important dimension, but it's Antarctica in the world and how that actually is so critical. Everybody's fridge, as Andrew kind of puts it, which we try and live in Australia without a fridge during the summer. I imagine is impossible. So there's a sense in which it's everybody's business, and I wonder how we can lift this up, because these discussions are very good in terms of bringing together a tightly organized group of thinkers who are creative and but getting through into the participatory kind of conversations that we've suggested that might happen. I think and you looking at how some kind of research study that actually begins to kind of develop these ideas, but also to it's not just a straight research, but an R&D project, how we might sort of take this and scale it up to a global level. Might be a way of thinking about this, starting with the normative questions: what is good for Antarctica, and what is good for Antarctica is good for the world, and what are the processes of emergence we need to develop to begin to address this? Because we haven't got, time is not on our side. Has anybody got thoughts about how we might structure such an inquiry?
Indeed.
Indy?
Well, I actually wanted to go back to something that Linda said, which I thought was really important, and because I think so. I mean, I think I don't have the sophistication, Linda, that you have in terms of the basis of the law. I think one of the things I'm really interested in is this rooted through morality, or is this rooted through enlightened self-interest? And morality, I think, and from my worldview, is rooted in separation, because you need morality when you recognize your separation, because you need a new way of dealing with potential externalities. And whereas actually entanglement means you no longer work with a moral perspective, you work with the recognition of your entanglement, which doesn't require morality. It's not that I'm being moral by doing something which averts a crisis to my own existence. It's just enlightened self-interest. And I wonder, the reason why I asked that question is that it frames where the political economy of and what political economies we activate and what political economies we construct. Do we construct an economy around the preservation of the Antarctic, or do we construct a preservation of the civilization that we have and the pathway of a civilization that we have? Which political economy are we building and enabling? And I think that's and our ability to hold both political economies, I also think it's really important that I think this is one of the things that I think progressives, if any of you have been watching what's been happening with Jeremy Corbyn and your party, you'll understand the sort of dilemma, which is all progressives try to get to the perfect and thereby destroy each other, as opposed to actually be able to hold the portfolio of goals necessary to achieve wins. And I think there's something really important for us to be able to hold a portfolio of goals into that reality. And I found that really, and I know it's a philosophical question, but I think the philosophical question opens up a question about what political economy we seek to build, how we orchestrate that political economy, and how we construct power as a means to orchestrate that, and where the theory of power is in this transformation story. So I just wanted to open that up. And I suppose, Barry, as you rightly said, I suppose what I'm interested in is how do we have these conversations? And not only how do we have these conversations, how do we construct the desire for these conversations and the demand for these conversations? And so build a desire and demand landscape of this future, I think, is a really strategic asset, because it's the construction of that desire and demand of that future that opens up the political pathways, opens up the political economies, opens up the pathways of power to be reverted in a really interesting way. And so how do we drive that? I think that was something that Andrew, both you and Barry were pointing to. So I think that conversation is so important. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Indy. That's very helpful. Joe.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, interesting conversation as always. I am at times in these conversations feeling a little bit sort of overwhelmed with the magnitude of it, in terms of yeah, like why am I here? Why do I keep coming to these conversations? But what I want to say here is, perhaps if Indy, what you were just referring to there around the morality, if I'm understanding that correctly, I find myself wondering whether does that mean that the question, what is good for Antarctica, does that contain a kind of moral judgment? Because it feels to me like what is good for Antarctica very much depends on where I'm standing. Like if I am, Andrew, you made reference to bad actors a couple of times. If I'm looking at wanting to extract from Antarctica, my version of good is going to be very different to perhaps those versions in what we might come up with in this room. And then linking back to what Cormac said about the parallels with the UN Declaration of Human Rights, maybe this is just too uppermost in my mind because it's something I'm thinking about in other spaces at the moment. But what I'm driving at here is there a question along the lines of, what are our responsibilities to Antarctica? And something that's been very uppermost for me is when the UN Declaration of Human Rights was kind of created back in the 50s, Gandhi was one of the people who was asked to contribute to it, and he refused on the basis that he said that without a kind of accompanying declaration of responsibilities, it wouldn't kind of work out in the long run. I'm going to stop there. And I'm wondering, yeah, about that framing around responsibilities, whether that's useful or not.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joe. Andrew, you wanted to come in there?
Oh yeah, just to maybe bridge what Linda and Indy are saying about um, morality versus enlightened self-interest. Uh, one of the one of the roles that I've played over the last 25 years is raising money for non-for-profits, and I've done it for a long time, and I've done it pretty well, if I may say so. And most people see it as a bit of a dark art. Like large gifts seem to land in people's laps, and others work around for a long time and they never get the gifts. And so I've actually constructed a bit of a heuristic or a map of why this happens and what needs to happen, what conditions are required for philanthropists to give a large gift. And and there's really just three elements. You need to, um, or I've determined that you give them relevant information, you manage their emotions, and you give them an opportunity to take a morally significant action in their life. Now, I raise that because morally significant is how they define it, and it's not a moral argument with other people. It's just how they are able to reconcile their life confronted by sick children or refugees or environmental degradation, and to give them the information to manage their emotions so they're not overwhelmed. Like you were just saying, Joe, like it's a big deal, but to show them that they can make impact by taking a morally significant action by using their stored resources, their money or their influence towards this cause. And so I only offer that because I think that you're both right in that we live in a world where it's very, very difficult to make a moral argument because everybody's sort of patching up their own moral frameworks according to, their own desires or their interests or whatever. At the same time, an enlightened self-interest should definitely be encouraged. But I think that there's a tension that a group like this can explore and bring into this space to understand what are the elements of morality that a person brings to this problem, but then what is the entangled, enlightened self-interest that we also bring as members of communities and societies.
Mm. Thank you, Andrew. That's very helpful. I was thinking when I was listening to you and Indy and Joe there, was the campaign to end slavery in the British Empire involved an alliance of people who did not agree with each other about lots of things, but did agree about the importance of ending slavery. So there were the Christians who thought that this was a morally repugnant practice. There were the slaves themselves who hated it and actually rebelled and went into violent revolution and took over various countries as a result, throwing off their slave masters. There were also economists who saw that the plantation economy was no way to actually run a modern world and instead wanted free trade. People like Adam Smith, who were actually part of the Enlightenment, seeing that. So the bringing together morality, what seems to be good and fair and right, also with what is in deep people's self-interest, like the slaves themselves, plus the prevailing, climate, the political climate, bringing those together is really important because rarely does one thing on its own actually make the difference when it comes to adding value in a moral sense. So that in a way, self-interest is really critical here. And also one of the things that really happened in the early 19th century, which actually made the establishment begin to take note, was the notion that they were afraid, that they actually saw the Napoleonic Wars and they saw the coming of the 1848, the year of revolutions. They saw Marxism rising. Those kinds of factors are really things that we could begin to contextualize and do some research about and see what would shift the needle on this. And in a way, using the resources of this group to begin to think about how to do that. Because we have the brains here. What we don't have is enough agency. We don't have the heft and the connection. And I think that would be, and I think Amaya's contribution about the participatory approach to this is really helpful because we can think about different ways of energizing the debate. I'm conscious of time. Was there anybody else who hasn't spoken so far, who would like to make a point? I'd like to bring in more people quickly if I can. No? Oh, Mike, yeah, please.
Thanks, Barry. Something you said before is resonating, which is everybody's business. But, Antarctica is far away. It's somewhere over there. The awareness is low of things we're talking about. It's very, very low. And to make it everybody's business, you've got to start off with everybody's awareness. And to start with everybody's awareness is just reframing what we feel. And it was something I put in the notes before. I mean, this is just one thought, which is, I was told we're doing some work for the Cape Town waterfront. And I was told, we're not the home of two oceans, we're the home of three. I think you were saying that it's actually one big ocean. With the home of three oceans, it brings it much closer. Now, what can we do with that? And there was one thing we suggested those years back to the waterfront is we're very famous actually for yacht races. The yacht races in the Mediterranean are, the Cape Town guys say that's swimpy, it's easy. When those guys go home, we come out. Because you've got the Indian Ocean, you've got the Atlantic Ocean, and then you've got the winds from the Southern Ocean. So I'm not saying that a three oceans yacht race is going to solve anything. It's going to get people's awareness. People start thinking differently, that this is here. It's not over there. Then all of these ideas, if I'm aware, I've opened a door. And then all this stuff can come through the door. But I think the door's closed. So how do we reframe what the Atlantic is? And maybe it's just to begin with, with Cape Town. I mean, everything's got to start. Cape Town's a global brand. The Antarctic isn't. So can we latch on? So as I say, it's a few different thoughts, but basically, on the last one, and my background is commercial, to make guess. There was an old advertising formula that goes back to 1903. It's called AIDA: awareness, interest, desire, action. And it's a funnel. So 100 people aware, 50 may be interested, 25 desire, 5 action. It's great. But we've got to fill the top of the funnel. And I feel that what we hear now is that bottom of the funnel. You know, we want action, but grow awareness.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mike. Andrew, you're next.
Just very quickly, and Mike, thank you for those insights. Cape Town is an Antarctic gateway city, so there are a number of cities around the world which are gateway cities to Antarctica. So ships and aircraft leave to go to the continent, and these are all middle powers. So from a diplomatic standpoint, middle powers can be very upsetting and irritating to the larger superpowers, and there's much more that could be said there. But part of the way forward is co-opting middle powers and saying that yes, this is everybody's business, but you could be very influential in diplomatic circles by throwing your weight around at the middle power level.
Thank you. I'm just conscious we've got 2 minutes left. I'm going to go to Cormac first, Linda second, and Indy gets the final word. Tamsin, I'll come to you last, please. Cormac, quickly, please. I'm just conscious of
Don't
time.
have much more to say other than I'm very excited about this. It feels like the start of something big. It may take decades, but I feel very confident, and particularly wonderful to see the responses from people all around the world contributing what they feel about Antarctica on the website today. So feeling great. It's a good Antarctica day for me. Thank you.
Oh, good. I'm so pleased for you, Cormac. Well done. Linda?
Yes, thank you so much for having this conversation. I love the questions and ideas that are being thrown out, and I'll throw out one more idea for us to muse about and maybe discuss next time, is this idea of governance, which came from the idea of steering, controlling the ship, and how do we roll back from that and realize our codependency that we're not actually steering the ship, and how do we rethink this concept in a way that is more inclusive and realistic. I don't have the answer, but I'm sure someone has some great ideas.
But that fits very well with emergence as a way of being. Thank you, Linda. Indy.
Not much before. Just great appreciation actually for what just Linda said. Maybe we're in a world beyond governance because governance is rooted in the theory of control, and we are now in participation. And that's fundamentally more interesting and fundamentally different to kind of the last industrial theory of control and separation. So I just really appreciate that. And I really appreciate the room. The one last thing I'd say is I'm actually interested in how we mobilize into this, because I think this is going to be the site of how we discover planetary governance. I think the Antarctic, I would put a good bet on. If we're going to figure out planetary governance for the 21st century and beyond, it will be here, and it will be in the negotiation of that here. And if we don't, I don't think we find a way forward. So I think this is a kind of a existential question for me, and I think we should start to build really and support everything we can towards it. So thank you.
Thank you. Lots of energy there, Indy, and I do agree with you. This is an existential question. Tamsin.
Well, I think Andrew should maybe get the last word on this one, but I'm very grateful, Barry, to you and Indy to you for this first provocation almost a year ago now. And Cormac, it's been wonderful to meet you and Linda. And this is a program that we will be continuing into next year and hopefully find the time that works for West Coast US, who's moaned a little bit at the 6 a.m. And so, Linda, thank you for being here. But yeah, I will do the notes from this call, and we will look at when the follow-up is. Mike, I loved your insights, and Cormac being based in Cape Town, I don't know if you know, but it would be probably very interesting for you guys to talk in terms of awareness between this and next December, which is the next Antarctic Day, which I think Cormac is the signing of the declaration of the Alliance. So thank you. I'll leave it there. And Indy, Andrew, Cormac, Barry, thank you.
Thank you. I'll give Andrew just a couple of sentences, Andrew, so I don't want to leave you out.
Thank you. I'm sincerely grateful for today, for all of you, for your contributions and your thoughts. It's amazing. As you said, Cormac, this is a group with amazing energy, and I'm excited about what comes. And I believe we can build this planetary governance, Indy, on the basis of the amazing work that the Antarctic Treaty System created. So it created a space, an extraordinary space, and it requires an update. And I think it's singular. If it's going to happen, it will happen in a place where we said 66 years ago this is important, and we now need to sort of re-update the operating system to do it again. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think we should be harvesting the assets on this call. And I was thinking particularly of Jim Barnes's book. And thank you everyone for taking part in this and being so kind of honest and forward-looking. And we're clarifying the issues. I'm sure we don't have all the answers, and we certainly don't have the answer to Indy's question, like what is good. But we know what the alternative is, and I think and it should be enough to motivate us. So thank you, everyone, and wherever you are in the world, I hope you have the rest of the day. And Andrew, I hope you can get some sleep.
Thanks, everybody. It was great.
Thank you.
Thanks all. Good luck, Cormac, with your
Thank you.
your busy day.